I'm Rebecca Schweinitz, an associate professor of history at Brigham Young University. I'm thrilled to be here with my colleague Matt Mason in the history department, Spencer Fluman. Other faculty are maybe going to join in remotely who are associated with the BYU Slavery Project back in Utah and elsewhere. And we also have nearly 30 BYU undergraduate students who have been involved with the BYU Slavery Project, including 4 who are with us today. And all of us are thrilled to be joining with folks at other universities who have undertaken projects to investigate, understand, and reckon with contemporary legacies of slavery, dispossession, and racism in their institutional histories. Not obviously rooted in the history and geography of antebellum slavery as it is popularly understood, although we all know that those popular understandings, in fact, have little understanding, right? BYU's past and present has been shaped by various forms of unfree labor and the afterlives of slavery. Moreover, the university stands on the homelands of the Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone peoples, and the teachings, policies, and missionizing, as Professor Wilder talked about earlier today, of BYU's sponsoring institution has had important implications for people of African descent and indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups. So I don't have to tell folks who have been involved in projects like this at their institutions that it takes a considerable amount of groundwork to get something like this going, including the work of individual faculty and coalition building and behind the scenes work across and beyond campus, as well as various forms of student activism. And yes, there is considerable student activism even at BYU. The slide that you see identifies the immediate launching point for the project. So it was a meaningful find in the archive that prompted specific discussions among faculty and campus entities and deans and administrators, and led us to create a project grounded in undergraduate education. Institutional strengths, including an emphasis on student-centered undergraduate research, and our experiences teaching and learning from and with students made this focus both obvious and especially exciting. And I think our most recent panel just before this session reminded us of the need for student perspectives and voices and how vital that really is to institutional reconciliation. Before I turn the time over to panelists, and we're going to save time to try to give everybody at least a few minutes to speak by presenting slides that introduce them, I'll just briefly mention that this is, of course, all happening in a larger kind of institutional and national context. Even before we began our kind of national reckoning with racism, that it was in response to the death of George Floyd and recognition of the deaths of many others whose lives have been lost to racial violence. BYU had a moment earlier that spring, an especially alarming example of overt racism on our campus. And that was followed by an insistence by students of color that incident not be ignored. And so our university president responded to that and made a statement pledging the university to the work of anti-racism. And then he followed that up in June of 2020 with another statement. We all know that those kinds of statements do and can matter, but they're often more performative. But in this case, the university president put together a committee on race, equity, and belonging, and their report was released earlier this year. And so now we're thinking about this BYU Slavery Project in the context of these larger, I hope, exciting efforts to address kind of the institutional relationship with these legacies. So, and then since this project was already kind of in the works and undergoing, it also creates something of a pressure point so that no matter kind of what happens or doesn't happen, there are things that are pushing and bringing the issue to the fore anyway. So with that.
Okay, I'm very happy to talk about my work with and what I've gained from students and others that we've worked with. We're in the second semester of teaching a course with undergraduate students doing research and then working through that research. I've been a professor a long time, and I remember very early in my career having a dream that I would just love grading student papers because I'd be learning so much from them. That has not often been the case, but it has with this crowd. Given the broad temporal and geographical and ethnic frameworks that kind of expand beyond our normal understandings of what American slavery is, and that take me out of my own field of expertise. I've learned a lot from these student research papers. We also have had a group of research assistants working over the course of the summer. We'll hear from two of them later on the panel. And it's that kind of in-depth scholarly work that these students have been doing and that has really benefited the program and the project. I mean, a lot of things are called projects these days. It seems like an overused word, but this feels like a project. It feels like a long-term study, not only unearthing the archival material, but then working through what we do with that institutionally, individually. So it has the feel a couple of years into it of very much of a project. And it's been a joy to have students be at the center of that project from the very beginning. That's all I have to say for now.
Great. So I personally, in the class, researched Brigham Young Academy's curriculums surrounding race, starting at its establishment in 1876 to the turn of the century. Brigham Young Academy was the forerunner to Brigham Young University. BYU's curriculum taught a similar racial hierarchy as other American universities of its time, but with added religious ramifications, emphasizing that non-white racial groups were fundamentally inferior, yet capable of progression through civil and religious assimilation. A lot of my findings came from debate and literature society minutes and published lectures, which reflected the scholarly themes of greatest interest and relevance to the campus, including students and faculty. I also found curriculums in student and faculty publications and faculty notebooks. I found that there were two main categories that frequently addressed race in the physical and social sciences. In the physical sciences, there are often mentions of phrenology and physiognomy, including lectures on Francis Galton's eugenics composite photography experiments. In the social sciences, whenever non-white civilizations were explicitly referenced, they seemed to be placed on a hierarchical racial continuum, from most to least assimilated by Anglo-Saxon standards. Native Americans were at the bottom of this continuum and seen as quote-unquote savages. Because the Latter-day Saints were settling into Utah, which was home to many indigenous peoples, they were in close contact with these groups. One BYU professor wrote of the quote, wonderful and awe-inspiring development in Utah had seen since being haunted by savage beasts and still more savage men, unquote. People from Polynesian islands were often taught about as primitive but prime for missionary work and conversion to Christianity. Polynesian islanders and indigenous Americans were often compared in LDS rhetoric, placing Polynesians next to Native Americans as quote unquote Lamanites, or a term meant to describe the descendants of Israel spoken of in the Book of Mormon, destined to return to Christianity through LDS missionaries. This was illustrated in a lecture which stated, quote, the Samoans have shown themselves capable of advancement. Christianity has been promulgated among them for many years, and they are generally ready to embrace the same, though they show considerable instability of character, owing perhaps to the traditional tendency to looseness and moral and usual voluptuousness, unquote. Chinese, Japanese, and Swedish cultures were all discussed on this racial hierarchical continuum, but the subordinating tone is most evident among groups furthest removed from white Anglo-Saxon culture. These are only some preliminary findings from examples of lectures of which we have records, but meeting minutes indicate that BYU students and faculty were infatuated with racial categories and their own superiority juxtaposed to other cultures. As mentioned, race curriculum had a profound and lasting impact on the campus and broader LDS community. Furthermore, these white superiority notions carried with them religious ramifications. For example, teachers were seen as spiritual leaders. All teachings were meant to carry spiritual weight. BYA's mission statement at the time, it said to not attempt to teach even arithmetic without the guidance of the Spirit of God. When BYA professors taught about the inferiority of other races, those teachings took on theological significance. It was either outrightly stated or implied that God himself ordained the progression of white men above other races. Brigham Young University continues to strongly identify as an institution dedicated to Christian ideals and values. In order to meet these ideals, it is essential that we examine how this well-intended Christian identity has in fact been utilized to subordinate people of color since BYA's establishment. Thank you.
In the summer of 2020, I discovered the identity of BYU's first Black student, Dr. Norman Wilson Sr. I discovered him by doing casual research on the school's yearbooks and came across him and was very surprised. Until this point, it was thought that the first Black student to attend BYU was a Nigerian international student in the 1950s, and that the first African American to attend the university was in the 1960s. This discovery led me to ponder how and why Norman Wilson was seemingly forgotten, if not erased, from BYU's historical narrative. I was able to investigate this as a part of the BYU Slavery Project, and by utilizing newspapers, Wilson's own publications, and interviews with his descendants to create a biographical narrative of his life. He was born in 1917, Gibbsland, Louisiana, in a small rural parish where he spent his youth picking cotton and growing vegetables, much like his ancestors who were enslaved only 3 generations prior. During his childhood, his cousin, Alenia Wilson, who studied under Booker T. Washington, returned to Gibbsland and taught him and his parents to read and write as well as arithmetic. When he came of age, Wilson attended Morehouse College and graduated in 1935 with a degree in economics. It was at Morehouse that he studied and even lived for a time with W.E.B. Du Bois. I believe it was here that he became inspired by Du Bois's talented 10th ideology to become, quote, armed with a 3-piece suit and a college degree, unquote. I also believe that it's due to respectability politics that Wilson both survived and was ultimately forgotten by BYU. Wilson attended the university from 1937 to 1939 and received a master's degree in agricultural economics. While at BYU, Wilson had to sleep in the local jailhouse as no white homeowner would rent to him, and he received all of his meals from a local family as he was not allowed to eat in local restaurants. Despite this segregation and other racial abuses, Wilson always turned the other cheek in the face of hatred and presented himself in a way that eased the fear of white residents. To Wilson, attending BYU was not a chance to usurp a white power structure. To him, it was simply a tool to further his own education. I argue this is one of the primary reasons Wilson was forgotten. He went out of his way to not be noticed, and upon graduating, never returned. Wilson would go on to be one of the first African Americans to receive a PhD from the University of Missouri and was one of the 15 founding members of Southern University at New Orleans and HBCU, where he would eventually found and become the dean of the business school. I believe my research highlights the importance of documenting the lived experience of people who were enslaved by universities, as well as students of color who attended these universities, by decentralizing the white men who are often given too much of the spotlight in this line of research. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mokto Hunter. I was a research assistant for the BYU Slavery Project during the spring and summer of 2021. I worked alongside with Emily Peterson, who could not join us today, but is presenting some of her own research at another conference. The two of us had the task of studying the early student magazines of Brigham Young Academy, which eventually became BYU. We examined the BYA students' 1891 run and the White and Blue from 1898 to 1903, eventually producing over 130 pages of annotations. As we read and compiled, we cast a wide net, looking for mentions of or evidence of in the publications of legacies and attitudes towards slavery, race, ethnicity, nationality, and indigeneity. Today, I'd like to share a very small, but I hope still interesting and instructive sampling of our findings. One of the main ways slavery gets mentioned in the publications is as a rhetorical device for contrast. For example, one issue excerpted the pedagogy of educator T.G. Rupert, who contrasted slavery with education. Education makes a person free, Rupert said, and ignorance is fit only for animals, slaves, and, quote, useless persons, unquote. Reprinting this type of material certainly shows no sensitivity to the recent civil war that took place or to the many African Americans and American Indians who had been held in slavery in the United States. The belief wasn't that slavery was not an injustice done to them, but rather a consequence of the inferiority that was seen in them. Another legacy of slavery is apparent in the presence of praise for people who owned slaves. Articles on history or social science education sometimes mention the American founders, such as George Washington, and unsurprisingly, none offered any critical analysis of their economic livelihoods as slave owners. Similarly, on the left, you can see an image of and reference to Abraham O. Smoot. He was a prominent member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he claimed ownership of several enslaved people who he brought with him to Utah Territory. Smoot was a major financial benefactor to the young Brigham Young Academy. His birthday became a campus holiday called Founders Day, and when he died, he was eulogized in the magazines. Additionally, Smoot family businesses frequently ran advertisements in the white and blue, which was another way his legacy played a role in providing financial support to the institution and its programs. Like Washington, Smoot faced no criticism or even acknowledgement for his enslavement of people. Another way race emerged in the white and blue was in its coverage of the Spanish-American War. In addition to demonstrating fervent patriotism supporting America's participation in the war and colonial seizure of overseas territories, the writers also relied on stereotypes that vilified Spaniards and denigrated Cubans and Filipinos. In a debate with the University of Utah, the Brigham Young Academy team argued in favor of U.S. retention of the Philippines, claiming that Filipinos were incapable of governing themselves because they were too backwards and needed to be racially uplifted by American governance. Finally, our most pleasant surprise as we researched was encountering evidence potentially suggesting the presence of students of color from the Pacific Islands attending Brigham Young Academy as early as 1903, maybe even 1900. Clarence Davids and Nellie Josephs were both described as, quote, natives of Samoa, unquote, and they began attending in 1903. Shortly before them, Edward Fernandez of Honolulu matriculated. And in 1900, a student author was credited as Nanua Kosefi, a distinctly non-Anglophone name. These students' presence speaks to the tension within both Brigham Young Academy and its sponsoring church. At the same time that it promulgated racialized teachings and hierarchies, the church also tried to globalize. Those who had contacted and ended up joining strove to make themselves part of the institution, moving in the face and in spite of these racial hierarchies and opposition.
Hello, my name is Lindsey Meza, and this past summer, my team and I were tasked with finding and documenting any mention of slavery and/or race by Brigham Young. Within this task, we looked at varying documents, including his own discourses, other high-ranking journals from other members of the church, and correspondence to and from Brigham. And what we found was a conglomeration of sources that helped to complete a better picture of who Brigham Young was and what he believed in. One specific document that I researched was the Discourse of Young announcing the priesthood and temple ban. This ban concluded that men and women of African descent could be baptized into the church, but that they would not be able to enter the temples, or that men would not be able to hold the priesthood. Both very important and vital parts of our beliefs in Jesus Christ and in the gospel. Essentially, they were limited to be second-class members. This ban was accompanied by multiple biblical justifications. He talks of the Africans as having been cursed, and that the only person who could lift the curse was the one who put it upon them, God. Despite these justifications, however, it is clear that Brigham Young's own personal beliefs deeply impacted this ban and the potential and the eventual ramifications of such a ban. In the same discourse, actually, he notes that in Britain, who recently abolished slavery, that their starvation rates were a meaner slavery than growing cotton. Another finding that shows one of the motivations of Young's stance on race is shown here above in a letter between him and Dr. John Bernheisel, a member of the church who was stationed in DC, reporting on politics. Young was very aware of the social and political ramifications that being an anti-slavery church would hold, who was also trying to be admitted into the Union as a territory. Bernheisel, in one of his letters to Young, actually encourages that no person of African descent be reported as a slave on their census, showing an obvious social consciousness of the ramifications that slavery would cause the members of the church and their potential self-governance. Trying to complete a better picture of Brigham Young's beliefs on slavery during the Civil War, we looked at Wilford Woodruff's journals. He cites during the same time around the Civil War a discussion that him and some other members of the church, including Brigham Young, had about slavery. While he doesn't specify any findings or any conclusions that Young himself came to, there is an article written by one of Brigham Young's wives, Zina Young, pictured above, where she talks about the Civil War. She writes of the narrative of the well-treated slave and the kind paternalistic slaveholders. This article was written after the Civil War, and she cites the end of slavery as being divine timing. Young also had a complicated relationship with the Native Americans in the area, the Nuchi. The contact between the Nuchi and members of the church was frequent given their close proximity. As many of you may be aware, there was also a slave trade of natives in the approximate area. In one discourse, after members of the church were cornered into purchasing 2 enslaved Native American children, Young encourages the purchase and adoption of Native Americans in order to, quote, raise them in the gospel. This oftentimes approximated indentured servitude. In another account, Young is recorded as saying that if a white man were to steal from you, to shoot him, but if a Native American was doing the same thing, they should not be shot because they don't know any better. This two-sided kindness is really complex and helps to add another layer to who Brigham Young was and what he really thought of race. I've only presented some of our more fruitful findings from this past summer, but it's important to remember that there is much to be found and analyzed, and that as we do so, we will be able to make a better and more complete picture of who Brigham Young was and what he believed in. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm a member of the advisory board for the BYU Slavery Project. I'm a psychologist at the Counseling Center on our campus. A lot of my work is centered around historical and racial trauma. And I've been able to attend a class once and kind of talk through that with students, and hoping to do that again in the future. The piece about historical trauma that I think is important to include in the conversation is that a lot of our students, and that's not just specific to BYU students, it's a lot of college students, when they develop awareness of history of racism, have experience a lot of distress about it. So we know, and there's quite a bit of research in psychology and the mental health field about historical trauma and how people who come from people who were enslaved or colonized or experienced genocide carry their traumas and their ancestors' trauma, whether it's genetically or psychologically, so that can manifest through physiological reactions and health problems that are passed on from one generation to another, but it's also often characterized by the way we interact with the world and the way we try to protect ourselves from the world. And so it's important for students who learn about trauma that affected their ancestors and therefore is likely still affecting them to have space to process that and talk through that. But it's also important for students who are not directly impacted by those issues to be part of that healing journey by processing the information that they're learning. And so we know that when individuals have space to talk through historical trauma and the experiences of their ancestors, especially when it's related to institutions they are still affiliated with, we know that that space to process that can make a big difference in how they move forward with that information and how they kind of thrive instead of be in survival mode all the time. And so I'm really glad that this initiative is creating space for students to do that, because I think it's a really important piece of the work. Another important piece of the work that maybe there's not as much published research about, but there are definitely conversations about this in the field, is historical resilience, and how just like we inherit our ancestors' trauma, we also inherit their resilience and the strength and joy that they were able to experience. And that often knowledge about history can become a way to cope with present experiences of oppression. And so, for example, we know that people who are more connected to their own history tend to respond, psychologically respond in what we call a more adaptive way to current trauma. So that will look like tend to rely more on community, tend to seek support a little bit more easily, tend to be able to talk through their experience maybe in a way that others might not be able to. And so again, this is an important piece of the work, and it's a really, I think, special thing that this is included in this project.
CEO, I'm Farina King, chiming in from Jalagi country in Oklahoma, and I've also served on the advisory board with the BYU Slavery Project. I'm going to show some images a little later. It'll come up on my screen, so I don't have to share my screen, but just FYI, in case they want to stop sharing the screen at a point with my bio. I think this conversation really makes us think about a lot of terms and language. It's been heavy on me, and I've been thinking a lot about it. How do we understand slavery? What does slavery mean? And I'm sure this is coming up in a lot of the very important conversations happening there, but especially the connections with land and power dynamics that fuse together from the other big part of this theme of the conversations today, and that you've been having, dispossession. Right? Stolen lands and massacres, bodies being controlled, manipulated, destroyed, taken and removed. And even, Lindsey mentioned adoption, that term, indentured servitude, today being National Day of Remembrance for U.S. Indian boarding schools, that I certainly think about in my area where I'm coming from with my work. These are interconnected, right, of different experiences, and what's called adoption is a dispossession of people's freedoms, their liberties, and a form of slavery. My experiences on the advisory board have been really powerful, as we've often had conversations about how do you define this project? What are the goals? What are the purposes? And I've been fortunate to be able to talk to other colleagues about that and students and meet them in Utah, even though I'm the one here who's not affiliated currently with BYU, although I was a student there for my undergraduate years and have friends and family affiliated with the institution. But those conversations, as you can tell, what the students are researching, some people might wonder, is that slavery? What does it mean? How does this relate to slavery? And that's where I think there's a lot here packed into that term. Themes of dispossession, as I said, colonialism, exploitation, power, control, use, and constructs of race to reinforce hierarchies and power dynamics. as a lot of educational institutions, even my own where I am now at Northeastern State University, they use language of being the light in the darkness. But what are the foundations of these kind of institutions? They often overlook, right, for very intentional purposes, it's forms of erasure of this dispossession and erasure of recognizing the ongoing legacies and ongoing ways of exploiting Indigenous peoples and diverse peoples who have been othered, their bodies and lands and intertwined with slavery and enslavement. And like I said, it's been great to be able to meet students like Makoto and Emily and be able to work with them. And in the summer, I actually brought in some of my own research and was invited to work with students on that. So let's see if this works. Do y'all see this image, hopefully projected next to me? I was able to work with Emily, who was with the BYU project, thanks to arrangements with the faculty involved with the project. And this was something I found in the BYU archives with while I was looking in there with Emily and the group. And this, let's see, going here. There's the back side of it. It's an image from about 1973. And in the center, in my own work, I'm trying to understand experiences of Native American students at BYU over the years, a Miss Indian BYU in particular. And that's a Miss Indian BYU I've met, Vicki Washburn, and Alan Cherry on the right. And on the back of this image, it had a description, a clear description of what's being pictured there. The language was, let me pull it up so I see it clearly. It basically was saying this, what is more American in that language? What is more American than a astronaut, a baseball player, and a cowboy and a beautiful Indian girl? That was the language. I have it actually there in the subtitle. And to me, there's so much to unpack here. In the 70s, right? There's that particular context. But why would we be talking about this in conversations about slavery? Is unpacking these histories of race at BYU that trace to these broader and ongoing legacies of dispossession and slavery. And I often feel like I'm constantly reminding people, right, that this is inseparable from Indigenous lands and peoples and understanding that. And as Rebecca mentioned, the work of the BYU Committee on Race, Equity, and Belonging that's happening now, and controversies being spread out about Brigham Young, even the namesake of the school, some things that folks are maybe thinking about with names and all these different arguments and contentions right now is what is in a name? What about when people focus on Brigham Young so much, do they know the story of Sandpitch, who Brigham Young ordered to be taken hostage during the so-called Black Wars, Utes of the Sanpete Valley in 1866? Those groups were led by Sandpitch, and women and children killed and forced onto the Uintah Reservation that in Thomas Alexander's work he talks about. Or Sally, an Indian captive who was in the house of Brigham Young. Or the Provo River Massacre of 1849 that is known as a battle, but was arguably a massacre. And while we're talking about an institution, this is also tied to a whole religion, a church, its legacy of race and applied interpretations of scripture that have been misused and harmful to people in the way it's been used. So even while, thinking about these terms and all the argument, the debates to change names, new directions and controversies, these struggles continue, I just want to remind everyone, especially how slavery comes in many names and forms, and it is at essence more than names. These are lives affected every day. And a term and a framework I want to throw out here to conclude is also ransom, where I think of this as a hijacking of sorts too, an emphasis to call out injustices, and how then do we really seek healing and reconciliation from these exploitative practices and systems that racialization enables. So that's what I want to conclude and end with, and thank, the BYU Slavery Project and all the people, especially students, who teach us so much. Yeah.
Okay, you've gotten a snapshot of some of the research and some of the thinking and things that we're trying to do with the project. We do have a question on Zoom, but if there are folks in the audience, we can start there. Or if, okay. So a question from Rachel Breckus is, speaking of dispossession, is BYU looking into the to white folks, including BYU people who engaged in residential restrictive covenants, kind of that long lasting, the after, the afterlife of slavery? This is another strategy of discrimination, and so.
That's an excellent question. As I understand our remit, it is to study these early connections between slavery and race and dispossession at BYU. And we have ranged pretty far chronologically. And Grace's paper is a good example of that, ranging well into the 20th century. We are committed as a research project into looking at the various afterlives of slavery in the way that was described in an earlier panel. We have had our research assistants in particular ranging pretty widely because we are interested in legacies, the kind of echoes and direct kind of quotations of previous racial theories that keep popping up just almost like clockwork. You can count on some blackface incident on BYU's campus or something like that. That reminds us, as if people needed to be reminded that this stuff is not just past. In fact, I should have made this clearer earlier. The first semester last fall was dedicated to students like Aïsha and Grace starting some of the archival research necessary. And then the summer included research assistants like Makoto and Lindsey continuing that in even greater depth. We had 6 research assistants. Right now, the course that we're teaching this fall is dedicated to questions of legacies, memory, public history, reparations, institutional responses. And so we have an administrative direction very early on to stay focused, but it's hard for us as historians to stay focused because of all these different legacies that send us in all these different directions.
So, and I'll just say that we do know of racial covenants in Utah Valley and in Salt Lake as well. And I mean, one of the things is there's been some research and some recovery of evidence of this type of racism and dispossession. But part of what we're trying to do is to build a database where we can, have located and available to other researchers and to the public and to students to do something with these documents and with this data moving forward. And like maybe Farina wants to say more about kind of some of our hopes for envisioning kind of the future of the project. I think that she's identified in her remarks, just the so many different ways to think about and that we can move forward and we should be moving forward.
Yeah, I actually think that's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up, because even my own father, when he attended, my dad went to BYU, and that's why I have a lot of interest in Native American student experiences there. And he talked about how he was a part of finding housing for Native students, and there was outright discrimination of housing for them, people to his face saying, oh, all Natives are drunks, I don't want them renting. So yeah, it certainly strikes a chord that there's a lot to investigate there, and so much work, as I think it was Lindsey who emphasized that, right? There's so much more to unpack, and it's quite remarkable, all the source material they're doing. Somebody mentioned in the Q&A too, the robustness of church records for the study of ancestry of enslaved peoples. Is that a major resource? I think that's something the students could talk about, is what kind of sources are you looking at, how you draw that divide between church resources, BYU, you know, when they are interconnected in ways.
For my research, we mainly looked on the church website and on their catalogs that they had. They have a lot of records on there that were available to us that we utilized.
This was a question we've grappled with a lot. I remember asking one of the faculty involved, and I said, you know, should we be drawing some lines here, focusing on just the university? And I remember being encouraged, like, no, these are entangled. These are, you know, you can't really separate them out without losing something. So I think, yeah, that bigger context comes into it. You know, we look at what is happening in the church, and we look at what's happening in the university, and they impact each other. And that's something Aïsha brought up, how curriculum is not just affecting students, but affecting this broader religious community.
Yeah, and I think my research was the one who dealt with religion the least. Norman Wilson, the first Black student, was not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was Christian, but just kind of non-denominational. And so to understand him and his experience, I had to reach out to family members and descendants of his, because BYU didn't really leave much records about him, and neither did the community.
So one of the institutional strengths is that BYU has, I think, the only bachelor's degree in family history. And so we have, you know, faculty who are dedicated and trained and teaching students those specific skills. And those have come into play in this project. One of our colleagues, Christopher Jones, has been one of the instructors, and he led a research team this past summer that is tracing the genealogies of folks who are associated with enslavement and in all its forms in Utah. And so we're building on some of those institutional strengths.
Hey, I don't mean to interrupt, but there's a really great question in the Q&A too from Timothy Paulson, who said, is there anything positive you found in the research where someone associated with BYU or the Academy led out in race relations in a positive way? Is there someone who stands out as a positive example of treating all with respect and dignity? Thank you.
In my research, thankfully, this is actually research for my honors thesis. It was not necessarily a part of this project, but I did find that there was multiple white students in publications and in BYU newspapers who spoke out against the way other students were treating faculty members of color as well as other students of color. In particular, one student complained about the lack of coverage of Martin Luther King's death. And she was told that it was kind of dead news. And so her response to the newspaper editor was that the death of a great man is never dead news, and we testify to that every Sunday as we study Christ. So she definitely came back with a punch.
Can I just add one of the papers from fall studied many of the early Latter-day Saint migrants to Utah were from Britain. And this paper studied their reactions sailing through New Orleans to seeing American slavery for the first time. And there was a range of reactions, but many of them were anti-slavery of various sorts. One of the things we are trying to rescue is a sense of a debate in early Latter-day Saint culture over slavery and race and all things connected to them, in part because we very often hear, well, you can't critique someone like Brigham Young because he was a man of his time. Don't get me started. But part of doing that research is to show that in his time, these things were contested, just like they were in the 1960s or whatever. So people have choices, and we are assessing the consequences of those choices.
All right, thank you very much. We do have a website, and we're on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all that stuff, and we'll be doing more with those things in the near future. So hope that you'll follow us.
Thank you so much. Can we give them a round of applause, please?
Thank you.